Everyone, welcome to another What I Would Have Done Thursday. And today for this video, I thought it would be interesting to address one of the worst in the Hollywood canon of filmmaking. And as you can see by the title and thumbnail, that is Gigli. Gigli. It's a very strange way in which this film has a last name of the main character whose last name you can't really pronounce. But that's the title of this film, and it is probably one of the most well-known as far as bad films is concerned. And like legitimately bad, like not in the category of The Room where you can make an argument that, it's so horrendously horrible that it comes off as funny. Whereas with Gigli, for the most part, with maybe a couple of exceptions of scenes, it just, the whole thing just comes off as really, really stupid and misguided. But like anything else, I think there could have been some improvements made to make it, I think, a little bit more tolerable. Tolerable. So I'm going to go over those things today. What I think really is the main, sort of, kind of, nail in the coffin for this film in particular is the main characters. Now, these main characters are either not interesting or just full of themselves jerks. In particular, Ben Affleck being the really, really full of himself jerk. And all the rest of the characters being like either very strange and bizarre and uninteresting at the same time. So, yeah, that's a major issue. I think this could have been on the more likable side, considering the fact that it is trying to be somewhat comedic, or at least be a little bit more lighthearted in tone, at least through the majority of the film. I mean, it just feels like it's trying to be more upbeat rather than dark. But there's a lot of bizarreness that happens within this film that doesn't make any sense. But I would have completely stripped that as well. So, not only do we have a character issue, we also have a plot issue because there's a lot of sidetracking that happens within this plot. And it actually would, I think, have been tolerable had there been some kind of actual real bonding that sort of exists with the characters. But since these characters have nothing to go for them, then that's a huge problem. So this is kind of what I would have done. I would have been like, okay, first off, Jennifer Lawrence there. Jennifer Lopez's character in this movie, I think, should have not been in this movie. Like, she serves no purpose. She's just there to say lines and be this kind of peaceful, hippie gangster. We really don't know. It's not really explained. Because she doesn't really want to explain who she is in this movie. So, yeah, I think the best thing to have done with her character is just to completely scrapped her, because I don't think she really provides anything that could have amounted to, I think, of real substance within this film. Now, what I think they could have done instead is just have the two main characters be Larry, which is Ben Affleck's character, and Brian, the other main character. Those two could have just stayed the two main characters, and Jennifer Lopez just be non-existent. Not even a cameo. So, and I think the way this plot could have been a little bit more interesting, and I think could have worked. One of the main characters, Brian, is supposed to have some kind of disability. Now, the way they execute that is really horribly done, obviously. But again, had they handled the character a lot better, we could have gotten something along the lines of Dustin Hoffman and Rain Man. So I think had there been more of an execution on the writers as well as the directing part, as far as the way they showcased Brian's character, they could have rolled, I think, with this idea that he has a disability. That could have worked, I think. Um, and then with Ben Affleck's character, I think what they could have done is yes, they could have made him a jerk in the beginning, have him be this gangster who's all for the money, and um, you know, he might be a little bit incompetent, but he still kind of ends up getting the job done. He's somewhat reliable. So they just decide. I think, um, excuse me, I think he actually should have been one of, like, he should have been very competent in his work as far as a gangster is concerned. But he's a little bit incompetent in everything else that sort of exists within his life, and he's very, he has an ego, he's narcissistic, and, he's um, very uncaring and very kind of sympathetic too. I think they could have rolled with that idea. Have him be a jerk, but eventually, when he's put into a situation where he has to kidnap Brian, and I think what they could have done is they could have said, okay, Ben Affleck's character, Larry, we want you to go out, and I think that's just such a weird name for a gangster, Larry. Hey, Larry, go and get this guy named Brian. But I think what they could have done is have him work for like a particular gang, have the crime boss be like, I want you, like, maybe the crime boss is in hiding because they're working on his whereabouts or something, and he decides that he wants to get a relative from the um, uh, he wants to hold a relative up for ransom, so that they'll maybe drop the charges, or well, I guess I guess the best way to put it would be, instead of capturing Brian just for the sake of not having a case, which again I think doesn't really make any much sense either, because that's how they initially put this plot. Yeah, it's really confusing. Instead of that, just have it be he wants money. He wants to get money from this one particular person. Maybe the guy actually does legitimately owe him money, and so he decides to hold a family member for ransom. Brian is that family member. So he's like, okay, Ben Affleck, I want you to do this for me. And, since he's in hiding, he's in a different location than Ben Affleck. So Ben Affleck, and obviously Ben Affleck has to go and get Brian and then bring Brian to that gangster headquarters or wherever it is. And basically, when and obviously the mob boss is like, oh, this is a slam dunk because we can use this. It would be an easy job because he has a disability, so he's not as he's more convincing to go with a stranger or something. So they figure that should be something that Ben Affleck's character Larry could do. So Larry ultimately finds Brian. Actually, he maybe just, I would have had it that he stalks him for a while and tries to figure out where he goes, and then eventually approaches him and then convinces him to go on a journey with him on an odyssey. Maybe there's something that Brian in particular likes and has never seen before. Yeah, like maybe he wants to go somewhere, and Larry's like, yeah, I'll take you there. Um, and so, they embark on this odyssey, and obviously, when you're handling someone who has a disability, there's obviously going to be some complications uh, with travel, sort of similar to what happens within Rain Man. I think they could have done that kind of an Odyssey thing that would have, I think, worked out to this film's advantage. And eventually, uh, Larry grows more sympathetic to Brian as time goes on, and then eventually he decides not to turn him over to the gangsters to hold him for ransom, and he turns Brian over to the authorities, and then he just skips town, and he and Brian never see each other again. That would probably be the best I could come up with as far as this plot is concerned, because really there's so little to work with. But I think something like that would have actually been genuine, because we could discover more about Larry's character, maybe his past. We can discover more about Brian, and then we would at the same time see maybe a change within Larry, where he develops into a more sympathetic character and eventually ends up quitting the gangster lifestyle. I think that could have worked a whole lot better than having this pointless character J-Lo in it, and meandering with a bunch of ridiculous things that don't amount to nothing, instead of crafting this relationship between two very different people, and in doing so sort of changing one of the characters' perspectives, and in doing so he ends up doing some good rather than causing harm or something. And maybe the person that's the relative um, of Brian, maybe he was somebody that was initially part of the gang, or there was some kind of mix up with the relative, and maybe the relative maybe not wanting to be a part of that lifestyle either, or something. There could have been, I think, a variety of ways where they could have handled that particular part of the story. But I think what really ultimately would, I think, have worked and would have been a sort of an interesting, kind of blend of characters would be this character of Brian and this character of Larry, and then ultimately Larry developing into a better person as a result of spending time with Brian and getting caught up in all of these shenanigans, as they kind of end up sort of road tripping. You know, maybe the climax could be, the gangsters try to come and, take Brian, and then Larry maybe saves Brian and turns him over to the authorities. Yeah, that could have, I think, worked in certain respects. And maybe too, Brian learns some things and maybe kind of stands up for himself at some points. Because I think there is a tendency for people with disabilities to be put down a lot. Maybe he develops some interesting kinds of new skills or things like that. And we see his capabilities, maybe similar to in Rain Man, where we see how Dustin Hoffman's character can play cards really well. Something like that I think could have worked instead of this really stupid, pointless, non-existent story of Gigli. Just have it be these two characters. They go on an odyssey. They end up discovering more about each other. Larry ends up being a better person. We end up discovering more about Brian, and Brian shows his capabilities despite the disabilities that he has. The gangsters are caught, and Larry leaves to search for a better life. The end. I think you didn't need to really make, a really complicated story out of this, and that's the interesting thing about the actual film, is that it complicates things where it doesn't need to be complicated. But yeah, I think that's really ultimately all I can say about this particular film. I mean, that's what I would have done. I'm sure there's others that would have thought up of something different, but that's really the best that I think could have come from a story and premise that this film was sort of trying to create. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say about this particular film. I will be delaying Fridays and Saturdays video again because I'm not going to be available on those days, but they will be uploaded and they will be taken care of, so you will have that enjoyment when it comes time. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you on the next video.